And towards the very end, a couple of verses at the end of the chapter, and then we'll answer the questions to chapter 2, and then we'll move on into chapter 3 together this evening. Almost finished up the chapter. We had a lot of discussion over the last couple of classes in relationship to chapter 2, and some questions and things that arose from that, and probably some more questions we probably could have addressed and talked about. But anyway, we want to finish up his last kind of parting thoughts in chapter 2, and then segue a little bit into chapter 3 tonight and examine the things that he shares as he begins to wrap up this very short letter in a lot of senses, which was in many ways short because it was a follow-up, in a brief span of time from the first. And so really the two books can really be looked at as almost together because there's not a lot of time span between when the first was written and when the second was written. But for now, let's look at chapter 2 together, and let's finish up here towards the end. Let's pick up in verse 15. As here at the end of his thoughts in this particular section, after all the warnings, and he reminds them, and it's one of those things, and probably it may have been a mistake in some ways to teach this class verse by verse. And I say that because really, to me, chapter 3 sheds a ton of light on why he said what he said in chapter 2. Remembering that Paul didn't sit down and write chapter 1, verse 1, go. Chapter 1, verse 2, go. He wrote a letter. And so his thoughts continue to flow. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we get to certain segments, particularly in chapter 3. But at the end of chapter 2 here, it says, therefore, brethren, stand fast. In light of all this, stand fast. Hold the traditions which you have been taught, whether by word or our epistle. Now here's what's interesting. What did he warn them about in the beginning of the chapter? Yeah, words and letters. You're going to hear things, but the source isn't valid. You're going to hear words. You're going to receive epistles as if we wrote them and we didn't. You're going to get all kinds of conflicting messages concerning what particular issue. And what particular thought in relationship to the coming of Jesus. The when, right? That's the issue here. The issue doesn't seem to be for them if he's coming back. Their questions more relate to when. Is it going to be really rapid, or is there a time period before he comes? And the secondary question might relate to how does that affect people that have died previous to that moment, and how does it affect people that will still be living in that moment? But it really ties more to the when than necessarily their faith about whether it'll happen or not. And so in the earlier part, he warns them. You're going to hear all kinds of things. Be careful. Don't believe everything that comes down the pike. Don't believe every thought that you hear. Don't rely upon every letter that you receive without some validation with it. Be cautious. Then he turns as he wraps up these thoughts and says, but the things that you can validate that came from me, the Apostle Paul, whether by word or by our letters, our epistles, those traditions, those thoughts, those considerations, get a hold of those. Stand fast in those things and hold on. And yeah, there is a sense that the Scriptures use the word tradition in a positive sense. Sometimes Jesus in particular spoke about traditions in a negative sense. He warned about how they had gotten so consumed with the men's traditions that they would almost honor man's tradition over what? Something that God had already actually spoken about and said. And so from an Old Testament standpoint it happened, and Jesus warns of the problems of that continuing. But in this particular moment, Paul speaks about tradition as in the thoughts, the purposes, the intents that he had shared with them. Stand fast in those. Get yourself grounded and rooted in the things that we've studied and talked about and shared with you. Remembering, what did he say in verse 5? They'd had all kinds of conversations, right? They had talked about things while he was there. Get yourself grounded in those things, he says. And that way, if you're more grounded in the things that the apostle has shared with you, the less likely what? You become distracted by all these things that come along. The less likely you become distracted and challenged by all these other thoughts if you've rooted and grounded yourself in the truth of the things that I've shared. So stand fast in them, hold on to them in whatever form that you might have received them. And now our Lord Jesus Christ himself, and God even our Father, which hath loved us, and hath given us everlasting consolation and good hope through grace, comfort your hearts and establish you in every good work, every good word and work. And so, after all the heaviness of the kinds of things he talked about in this segment, he comes back and says the purpose is to establish you, the purpose is to comfort your hearts, the purpose is to strengthen you, and that you'll fulfill every good work, every good word, every good purpose, everything that has been shared, and everything that we've strived to encourage you to be involved in. Stand fast in those and get busy in them, because remember, one of their great problems is they're sitting around. They're sitting around waiting for the return of Jesus. And he's going to talk further about that in chapter 3 concerning that mindset. Any thoughts or questions about that? I really had not hoped to leave that little tag at the end when we finished Sunday, but it just happened that way. All right, grab your question sheets real quick. We'll answer these and then we'll move on into chapter 3 and look at some of the things. Some of those are a little easier to understand in chapter 3 as opposed to the things we looked at here in chapter 2. But if you have your questions, and I'll pull them up on the screen so you can see them there as well. What did you match with holdeth to? Yeah, revealed in his time, right? He as God sitteth in the temple, I think is the right match for that. Will let or restrain. Taken out of the way is until he was taken out of the way. If you recall, he will let or restrain him until he's taken out of the way, if you recall that segment. The Lord shall consume. That's 8, the spirit of his mouth. Shall destroy. The brightness of his coming. Deceivableness of unrighteousness. Okay, I think I had that as E as well. In them that perish. God shall send. G, okay, the strong delusion. Believe a lie. D, okay, be condemned or be damned. And stand fast. C, hold the traditions and comfort. That was comfort your hearts. That was the last text that we just looked at a moment ago. The man of sin would show himself that he is God. That's true. Show himself, that doesn't mean he was. It just means he would attempt to show himself in that fashion. Paul said the mystery of iniquity was not yet at work. That's false. He said it was at work. He said the exact opposite, I believe. Paul said those involved in apostasy love the truth. That's false. They're the exact opposite. He said because they didn't love the truth was part of the reasons these problems were occurring. Those who received the strong delusion had pleasure in unrighteousness. Yeah, that's the ones that in other words, they had brought it upon themselves. Yes, God is involved. He's permitting it, and He's allowing for them to believe the lies and things that are perpetrated before them, but they're making choices to follow things that are not based in truth. Paul prayed that Christ would establish them in every good word and work. I don't think I'm going to say those in the right order the rest of the night. This chapter concerns the final coming of the Lord. I believe so. It was difficult in trying to grasp some of those things. Paul said the man of sin would exalt himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped. Yeah, he was going to try to exalt himself. Paul taught that we ought to stand fast in the traditions of men. That was false. He said the traditions that he was delivering them that came from God. We are called to obtain the glory of Christ. True. And finally, God sends a strong delusion to some. And those who had chosen that path that we just discussed a moment ago. The man of sin is called, yeah, that's right, the son of perdition in this text. And we talked about that. The man of sin would show, okay, power, signs, okay, power, signs, and lying wonders. We are bound to give thanks always. Okay? Give thanks always. I'm not sure why I'm writing these because you probably can't read a thing I'm writing on here. Paul said they were called by our gospel. Okay. They were to hold traditions taught by word or by apostle or by epistle. God hath loved us and hath given us everlasting consolation and good hope. Okay. And good hope. Let no man deceive you by any means. And the implication of a warning that says don't be deceived by any means that Satan will use any means, right? Everything's on the table. Any means by which to challenge folks. That day shall not come except there come a falling away first. And again, he had discussed personally with them some of those specifics, but the intent of the letter was to remind them that certain events were going to have to occur before Jesus would return. And their mindset about that they could sit back and just kind of take their ease because he's going to be coming back immediately, they needed to not think that way. The man of sin would be after the working of Satan, and God hath from the beginning. Okay, from the beginning. What misunderstanding did Paul seek to correct in this chapter?
Christ is coming.
Yeah, and we talked about it at the beginning of our study tonight. That's the focus of the when these events would occur. Does Paul indicate the source of his misunderstanding?
Yes.
Yeah, and remember that's where he lists all those things: the spirit, the attitudes, the words, the letters that were seemingly from us but aren't. Those are the kinds of things that he listed as causing this misunderstanding. In other words, he wasn't the source of the problem. The misunderstanding didn't derive from the fact that he had shared information with them that confused them so much as it was they heard what he said and then misinformation got fed into the mix, and that's what convoluted and confused the thing. And that's generally what happens when misinformation is added into the equation. Does Paul predict an apostasy in this chapter? Yeah, he talks about that falling away that's coming. Identify the characteristics of the man of sin.
One who doesn't acknowledge God.
Okay, wouldn't acknowledge God.
Opposes, exalts himself.
Okay, exalts himself. He'll even be worshipped in some senses that are described there. How had Paul formerly warned them of an apostasy?
Yes.
Yes, he had, and he had done that when he was there, okay, in personal discussions with them. Name 3 things by which they were not to be troubled. Spirit, word, or letter. And when was the man of sin to be revealed? In his time, right? God had a plan and design, a time for him. What did Paul say would be the ultimate end of that wicked one? Destroyed or consumed. Why were some to be involved in apostasy? No love for the truth. No love for the truth. And by what means were they chosen to salvation? There were 2 things that listed there specifically, I believe. Sanctification of the Spirit and belief in the truth. Those were the 2 specific things in this particular moment that were outlined in relationship to that. Okay. Hopefully we talked enough about those items as we went through the study. Well, the man of sin is a point at a time where God will no longer restrain his revealing. If you remember that whole picture that was being drawn. So Paul basically says there was a restraint upon the man of sin and his ability to be revealed, and that ultimately he would be revealed in His time. There's an appointed time, if you will, a moment in time where God removes restraint and allows for that revelation to occur. So I believe that's the reference. Yeah, God. This is all part of God's plan and purpose, and God is not ready yet for Him to be revealed in His fullness, and so He's got an appointed time for that, as He had with so many other things as well.
So we still got a time to go yet, then, right?
Yeah, they did.
Does that mean for us too?
No, I don't think so. I think they know the answer to what we can't figure out in chapter 2. I think they would have begun to see those things revealed. I don't think you tell them the way He converses. So I think that we're not still waiting on that. My conviction is that it's already occurred. It's a past tense thing to us. It was a future tense to them, but a past tense to us. I've got my own philosophies about that. I just don't want to muddy the waters by telling you what they are, if that makes any sense to you.
He's talking about the false teachers that...
He's talking about, here's what I mean by that. I've got an idea of what I believe the specific thing is. But I can't tell you with 100% certainty that's true because I wasn't there. But he's talking about a falling away, an apostasy that is to come. And he had a conversation with them in Thessalonica. They would know because he told them. He gave them more details than he gives us through this letter. And so I don't know. My conviction is, Jim, we're not still waiting on this. This is an event that has already transpired. Their time. Yeah. Or shortly, within a shorter span of time than to us at this point. And keep in mind, because think about it, he said the seeds of this were what? They're already going, okay? So you imagine that. Think about that. He tells them that whatever it is he's talking about, whatever this apostasy is that he's addressing, it's already started. It's just a matter of restraining the details for a little longer period of time. But it's already in the works. I don't know that you talk about something already in the works, and then we're still waiting for it to happen in 2016. I don't think that connects in relationship to this conversation that he's having. Okay, chapter 3, which should be far less confusing, maybe. So he says, finally, brethren, pray for us, that the word of the Lord may have free course and be glorified even as it is with you. Now, again, no wasted words, right? So, and I think that's important in chapter 3 especially. And what I mean by that is don't isolate it. Don't switch all the switches off and say, Paul talked about all these things, and then he turned all those switches off and he came over here and now he's talking about something completely different. Don't believe that's the case. I don't think we've broken thought in what he's expressing now. What was going on? People were being misinformed. People were given false letters. People were given false information. And so what's he commend them to do in this finally, brethren statement? Number one, pray, and that the word of the Lord may have free course. The best way to defute and to overcome misinformation is to provide what? The true information, right? And so Paul warned them about what was happening with misinformation. Now he says, pray for us and the work of sharing the message of truth and allow for it to have the same kind of level of free course that apparently this misinformation was. And that who will be glorified? God would be glorified. Who's the man of sin? What's he interested in? Glorifying himself. Okay, the man of sin was glorifying himself. He wanted to be worshipped. He wanted to be exalted. Paul says, pray that the free course of the truth is allowed to flow so that the Lord gets glorified. Not men, not folks looking to make a name for themselves, but that the Lord gets glorified. And he commends them by saying what? As it is with you. Okay? Pray that everybody has the same ability to know and hear truth just like you did. And gets an opportunity to come to real, honest conclusions about that truth. that the Lord is presenting. And that we may be delivered from unreasonable and wicked men, for all men have not what? What faith? That's right, the one He's been building in them, right? The one He's been educating them in, the one He's been strengthening them in and commending them in. And so He says not everybody has that faith. And because their lack of conviction and faith, they become what kind of description here? Unreasonable and wicked. So the imagery I see here is that the people they're dealing with in relationship to forcing this idea that Jesus is coming is more fixed in terms of its immediacy than they could legitimately say. He's saying they're unreasonable in their approach. They're wicked in their approach. Well, they're obviously wicked if they're passing around forged letters in order to bolster their position. If they're walking around blatantly exalting themselves over that which God has said. Wicked is a fair description of that kind of mindset. And generally when people begin to promote themselves, how reasonable are they? Not very, right? They're generally not very reasonable because they have an agenda. Yeah, pride steps in. There's all kinds of challenges. And so he says, you're going to see this apostasy and this falling away and this man of sin slowly become revealed. Eventually the restraints will be off and you'll fully understand it in better ways. But in the meantime, stick with the faith. Stay with the truth of the gospel that's been shared with you. Allow for it to have free course that others may hear it as well. Be ready to deal with unreasonable and wicked individuals in this process. Because when people get driven by their personal agendas and they don't have any conviction in relationship to God, who knows what they will bring. But at the end, what's God do through it all? Verse 3. The Lord's faithful. Okay, you be faithful. The Lord's going to be faithful. The Lord's not going to leave you. The Lord's not going to abandon you. The Lord is going to be faithful to you through these challenges. You be faithful to Him. And if you'll do that, what will be the result? Number one, He'll establish you. I'm almost afraid to say this. Have you ever tripped? I won't talk about falling. There's too many in this building. That's personal. But we've all tripped, right? And what do when you trip? You reach for anything and everything and hopes that there's something that will what? Establish you. Something that will stabilize you. Something when my footing is weak, when I'm challenged. Something that will support me in that. Who do they have through? The Lord. The Lord is going to, if you'll be faithful, He'll be faithful. And He'll establish you. Even though things get shaky, even though there are this man of sin and this apostasy that's beginning to already take root among God's people, if you'll stay steadfast, He'll stay steadfast. And what's the result? Keep you from evil.
This version adds one on the end of that, evil one.
From the evil one. Sorry, I've lost. Maybe it'll come back. Hopefully the voice will come back. We'll have to do more talk.
That's the same thing he had in his previous chapter.
Yeah. And just looking quickly at it, and I did not particularly look at that particular, but just quickly looking at it, we're single word in the Greek. And so whether he has, of course the connotation of that would be Satan in mind or not specifically, I like, and when I say I like, I'm comfortable with the more generic thought that he's establishing us and keeping us from because that's really what's going on. The evil that is around them and the evil. Now certainly Satan's behind every ounce of evil that comes, and so we could easily make that connection. But either way, we can appreciate that being established and dedicated unto God is what keeps us from evil. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we try to defeat evil on our own. And then we fail and we give up. And we have to be mindful that it's God that's trying to establish us and steady us and maintain us so that we're able to deal with the evil and challenges that come. And with that comes what in verse 4? Confidence. What generally breeds confidence in any kind of thing in life? Success. Right? The more you're able to accomplish something, the greater confidence that you build in it. Once you've been able to successfully do it once, then the next time it's a little easier, the next time it's a little easier, and then you slowly become proficient, and then maybe even rise to master certain skill sets that we might encounter. Same thing here. By our dedication, our faithfulness, our devotion to God, we become established in Him. We start finding ways to overcome the evil that comes, and we grow our confidence every step of the way. And a lot of times what we simply lack spiritually is just the confidence to take the next step. And we for whatever reason, whether it's fear, whether it's distraction, whether it's evil, there might be a whole host of things. But many of us simply lack the confidence to trust God enough to put the kind of faith in Him that we need to be as successful as we could be spiritually. If you both do and will do the things which we command you. Confidence comes as you're obedient. You do the things we've commanded, strength will grow, benefit will come, and greater things can occur in relationship to them. And the Lord direct your hearts into the love of God and into the patient waiting for Christ. So think about it. Why do I need faith? Because this may be a longer journey than I thought. Why do I need to be ready to face the evil or the evil one? Well, because I may have to go to war with him more than I thought. Why do I need confidence? Well, because if I let evil begin to win and my confidence wanes, evil's going to win the battle and eventually win the war over me. And I need to be patient through the whole thing because the coming of Christ is a what? It's a waiting process. It's a waiting process. That's the nature of as comes as a thief in the night. It's a waiting process. When you don't know, the only option you have is to be prepared and wait. And that makes it hard sometimes. Go ahead, Ron.
Okay, you were talking about this all this a while ago too. We need to put ourselves in this situation and try to understand what they were facing back there in the early times. And then we learn from that now. And like 1 Corinthians or Romans 15:4 says, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. That's referring to those of the Old Testament, written so that we might learn.
Yeah.
Now these things that are written to them, if we put ourselves in their place and follow through with it, we'll get the same information that they got, with a little more knowledge. If you understand, follow me.
Right. And we gain the benefit of not only their experiences, but the experiences of everyone in the collection of the Testament. Yeah. And we can appreciate just from them, if they were to wait, we need to patiently wait and be ready for him at any point. But in some senses, which is easier? If I told you I'm going to give you $1 million and I'm going to give it to you tomorrow, or if I tell you I'm going to give you $1 million someday, which one works? But you understand what I mean. When we see things in an immediate sense, we become much more comfortable with that. It's easier for us. But when we're told to wait, it's like asking us to do some tremendous act. But that's what he says. You're going to have to be ready, to be diligent, to be faithful, to follow commands, establish yourself in God, and in the process of time, wait. And wait for when God determines the appropriate time for His Son to return is.
This version of verse 5 has waiting of Christ. Does that mean it seems different? Waiting for Him, for the patience of Christ, for Christ. Like it's saying that Christ is patient for what He's going to do instead of us being patient for Him.
Well, and I get there is a subtle nuance between the two, but if you notice, since it's all one sentence, the Lord direct your hearts. They are the ones that are under conversation, not something Jesus is going, not something for Jesus. In other words, this is something for them. So let the Lord direct your hearts into the love of God and into the patience you need to wait for Jesus. And I think because of the greater context, because that's the conversation. The conversation is you need to wait for Jesus to come in His time. And I think that's probably why you see some translations use the word waiting for or patience for Jesus rather than this. They're saying the same thing. The purpose is the same, though, is to direct our minds to recognize that we need patience because we don't know when He's returning. And it may be a longer period of time than we thought. Verse 6. Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry.
Christ doesn't know either.
Yeah. In that sense, too, you could add.
It's perseverance of the situation.
Yeah, and in essence, there's a patience between us and the Savior in terms of when that return will be, because He Himself doesn't know when that return will be. And so there is a shared experience in that sense as well. So verse 6, and this is one of those moments when in my study of this chapter that I feel like that maybe we overgeneralize verse 6. And I'm not saying there aren't some general principles. What I'm saying is we need to understand verse 6 within the context before we start pushing it outside of the context. And so he says, now we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly, and not after the tradition which he received of us. What's been under conversation here? What tradition's been under conversation? Yeah. The conversation has been about the misinformation relating to the coming of Jesus. And Paul says you need to hold on to the traditions we gave to you concerning those things. The language hasn't changed.
That relates back to verse 2 of chapter 2.
Yeah.
And I can imagine some of those things that were written were mocking.
Yeah.
Well, you said that the Lord was coming, and He hasn't come yet.
Yeah.
And people still say that today.
Right. And so and of course that's kind of a little bit of the reverse of what they're dealing with, because they're thinking that the discussion of them is it's coming right now, and the challenges of that. And then you've got the other side of that conversation as well. But here's what all I'm trying to make sure that we recognize. In the moment when he says, withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly, you can almost hear the conversation. Paul, you've told us that I'm going to have all these people trying to misinform me. I'm going to get word. I'm going to have attitudes. I'm going to have letters. What do I do about it? How do I handle these individuals that continue to come to me with this misinformation concerning Jesus, who aren't walking orderly according to the commands, verse 4, that have been given by Paul and from the apostles? What do I do about those guys? What's Paul say? Draw yourselves from them. Okay? Your best option is to withdraw yourselves from any brother, every brother, who's walking disorderly, in particular in connection to what the conversation is about. Now, I appreciate that there are some principles at stake here as well. I'm not saying there aren't, but I believe we also need a word of caution that we don't pull verse 6 and like we do so often with things and pull it out and stick it over here by itself and give it its identity all to itself. It's said within the framework of something. And it's said within the framework of people who were disorderly in their dealings with the coming of Jesus. And in particular, who do they need to withdraw themselves from? Who are the disorderly? They're the people that are teaching things contrary to when Jesus is coming back. That's the specific nature of those who are under conversation.
Are you talking about the people back in chapter 2, verse 2?
Yes. So that's the specific conversation that's going on. Is concerning those who are walking disorderly. Otherwise, it seems awful arbitrary, would it not? Seem awful independent and arbitrary for him to just all of a sudden, he's talking about a generic principle of withdrawal that is completely disassociated with the conversation. I think we make a mistake if we jump to that conclusion that his teachings are outside of the context of the situation. Again, there may be some generic principles that we have to draw from here about how you deal with those who are walking disorderly. And we're going to see in a moment. Let me add it because I think in fairness, and they walk disorderly and not after the tradition which he received of us. For yourselves know how you ought to follow us, for we behave not ourselves, what? Disorderly among you. Keep going because I think you've got to see the whole thought. Neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an example unto you to follow us. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he what? There's another verse, by the way, we pull out of the context of the passage. But let me stop you for a second. Now think about all that he just said. Okay? Think about everything that he just said. He compares himself he contrasts himself. The disorderly one in verse 6, Paul says, what about that in verse 7? I'm the orderly. Okay, I'm the opposite. So you have disorderly people walking among you. I'm the opposite. I'm the contrast. I'm the orderly. Okay? Well, in what way are you the orderly, Paul? In what way are they the disorderly, Paul? For, connecting thought, yourselves know how you ought to follow us, for we behaved ourselves not disorderly among you, neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you, not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an example unto you to follow. For if any, even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. What's going on with those who think Jesus is coming right this second?
They're not working.
They're not working. There's
They're
idleness.
just sitting around.
And he defines that idleness as what in verse 6? Disorder.
Yeah, because
That's... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, some of the translations have it as idleness all the way through on this.
Yeah. And again, all I'm trying to get all of us to do, first and foremost, is to understand the narrative within the conversation and to not quickly make conclusions about independent thoughts without first seeing them within the whole. The disorderly that Paul was dealing with in this moment, I'm not saying that the Bible doesn't talk about other issues in relationship to this subject. What I'm saying is, in this moment, the Apostle Paul is dealing with disorderly individuals, and he defines them as those who were sitting back doing nothing. And he said that guy shouldn't even eat, let alone be pursued and put forward as one who's being faithful.
And like you said, he was working. He was actually working with his hands as an example to show them, that you need to keep working.
Paul says, I'm the exact opposite in relationship, not just to the things I'm teaching, but the things I do. I'm the example of one who could have had power and said, you need to take care of me while I'm preaching. But he didn't. And he recognized the danger that would bring to a group like this.
This version uses the word, instead of power, it uses authority.
Yeah. I could have used my power, my authority to tell you, you're going to take care of me, but I worked with my own hands instead while I was there. Though the idea of one walking disorderly can have a generic principle to it, the idea can be, and I can accept the idea, that disorder is without order. And so anything that breaches the commands and teachings of Christ are out of order. And so I understand the generic sense that these thoughts. I just wanted to make sure in my own study, and my presentation to you was that we at least took a moment and looked at it in relationship to who's he talking about in this moment. Who are the disorderly? And the disorderly in that moment were the people who were promoting these notions that was allowing for idleness. And Paul puts a stop to that and says, withdraw yourselves from these folks. And certainly don't continue to expedite and provide for their disorder. If they're not willing to step up and take some responsibility, he said they shouldn't even eat. That sounds pretty harsh, but I think Paul's, you kind of get a sense of frustration with him when he to tail into this letter.
2 John 8, verse 10 and 11. If they come in unto you and bring not this doctrine, receive them not into your house, do the bid them Godspeed. For he that biddeth them Godspeed is partaker of evil in the deeds. Now, if you're going to sit around idle, you're going to start listening to a lot of things. No, that sounds good.
Yeah.
And rather than saying, you don't get into my house, I won't listen to what you're saying.
You make yourself right for the opportunity to be persuaded and influenced by evil when you're just sitting around all the time. And so it adds to the challenge that they're dealing with here.
Is he saying there about in verse 8, he didn't want to burden them, but he did have the authority to require something from them?
Yeah, it would have been perfectly within his right, if you will, for him to accept sustenance and care from them for his spiritual labor that he was rendering. But in that particular moment, he realized that if he's going to present a pretty stern message about get busy or quit eating, which is what he said, if he's going to be that strong, he knew he was going to have to be the right kind of example. And if they could turn around and say, what are you talking about, Paul? You didn't do anything but talk while you were here. And we fed you and clothed you and took care of you and provided for you. So he knew the danger of that and showed them what he meant by working with his own hands while he was there.
Well, the way I was looking at it, he basically explained why you're not supposed to have any contact with them. I mean, he didn't say that he wouldn't accept hospitality given time, but he's saying in this that he wasn't dependent upon them for his living.
Yeah.
That he worked for his living, and that they should not be giving them hospitality and further in their idleness.
Yeah.
That's basically what he's saying, because he goes down to the last there of I think it's verse 14, where he's talking about, you don't treat them as an enemy.
Right.
So, you're still supposed to show brotherly love and mourn them.
All right. There is a difference between continuing to strive to stay connected to individuals to allow for communication and for benefit spiritually. But it's a whole other issue if I'm providing for their misbehavior and if I become a participant in it in that sense. Add verse 11, by the way. I shouldn't have stopped. For we hear that there are some which walk among you. What's the word? It's the same word we've been looking at, right? And then Paul defines it for us. Why are they disorderly? They're working not at all. Back to what Roger said a few minutes ago, but are busybodies. So if you asked me quickly tonight, who are the disorderly of 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Notice that I defined it. Who are the disorderly of 2 Thessalonians chapter 3? It's these that are sitting idly and not working at all. That's how Paul defined the disorderly in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. And I keep repeating that because there are other texts that deal with the same kinds of issues that have a different context in mind and have a different kind of behavior in mind or a different kind of challenge in mind. In 1 Corinthians 5, it's fornication that hadn't even been heard of among the Gentile world that's specifically under discussion. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, it's individuals who had chosen an idle approach to life and were considered disorderly because of it. And so just recognize there's a very specific conversation happening within this narrative. And you can sense it because remember the first letter, remember the second letter, the whole concept of defeating or encouraging Christians to appreciate the truth about when Jesus was coming back and what they should do in the meantime. Keep busy. If somebody dies before Jesus comes back, is that going to hurt their chances for benefit? Paul said what in the first letter? No, it's not. It's not going to hurt them at all. They'll benefit just as much as anybody who's alive and remains when he comes back. That seems to be the starting point of why they were concerned about the fact that Jesus hadn't returned yet. Because there were people dying and he hadn't come back yet. And it concerned them. And then this whole big conversation ensues based on that one single problem of when Jesus would return and how that affects other people. And now he's warning those who have become idle and lazy and are just sitting back doing nothing because they're convinced that Jesus is coming probably here in the next hour, and so why should I do anything? Paul says you don't know when he's coming. Paul says there's lots of things that have to happen before he can come back. You just need to be patient and stay busy and be ready for his return.
People who are not working usually have too much time when they're
Yeah. Now,
they get mixed into other things they shouldn't.
right. Not having anything to do and becoming a busybody generally go hand in hand. And because generally when folks don't have enough of their own things to take care of, they will look for other people's business to take care of. And that's creating a challenge for them. And think about it again. If in light of what's going on with them, they become busybodies. In other words, they're walking from person to person, place to place, and they're saying, hey, did you see that letter? It looked like it came from Paul. We're not sure, but it said something completely different than what he said when he was here. And you can see how all that would come as they would go from person to person and spread and perpetrate this misinformation concerning all these things. The busybodies would not stay focused long enough on truth. They're sending and continuing the problems that are going on there. Okay, Lord willing, we'll come back. We'll finish up chapter 3, and we will answer the questions, and we'll give you some things to work on to finish out the quarter on Sunday.